A hot topic in Birdland early this offseason has been who will be Adley Rutschman's backup catcher for the Orioles in 2023. Well, today we'll talk about two guys who held the backup role in 2022, and Anthony Bemboom and Robinson Chirinos, talking about their season and asking the question, could either of them win that role heading into next year? That's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, October 20th, 2022, and welcome back to the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we will continue our Orioles 2022 player review series as we're looking back on every player that had at least some sort of key role with the Orioles this season and breaking down the year they had with the O's and what they could do with the Orioles moving forward. And today, we talk about the two backup catchers in Robinson Chirinos and Anthony Bemboom. We'll break down their seasons, talk about why Chirinos was the backup all year despite his struggles, and if Bemboom is currently the front runner to be Adley's backup in 2023. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast. Before we get there, though, just did want to thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first podcast listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcast listening platforms. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating and a review if you listen on Spotify or Apple Podcast. It really helps out the pod. And make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. We've got new episodes Monday through Friday, 5 days a week throughout the MLB postseason. Then when we get into the offseason, we'll still be 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday here on the pod until we get to spring training and back to 5 days. As this should be a fun offseason, though, to cover. We thank you for being here with us, and we thank you for making Locked On Orioles your first listen of the day. For your first listen today, we're talking about a couple of catchers. Now, coming up next week, we're going to do our Adley Rutschman episode, which, of course, is going to be very fun to break down the incredible rookie season for a guy who could win AL Rookie of the Year. He was that good coming up and joining the Orioles in May. But today, still a fun episode, just in a little bit of a different way. Let's talk about the two guys who at one point served as the Orioles' backup catcher this season, Robinson Chirinos and Anthony Bemboom. And we'll start with Robinson Chirinos, the 38-year-old catcher who the Orioles signed to a one-year, $1 million free agent deal last offseason. Now, coming into this year, we talked about this back in March when the Orioles signed Chirinos. I thought it was a pretty solid pickup to eventually be Adley's backup. Now, the Orioles signed him, and we eventually found out he was going to be the starter when Adley went down with the tricep injury in spring training. But Chirinos was signed to be Adley's backup. You get a veteran in there who's been around the big leagues for 10 years. He's been on playoff teams, especially in Houston, World Series teams as well, has been around the block. Mike Elias familiar with him in Houston as well. And just a good veteran guy to have in the clubhouse who still had the skills behind the plate as well. His defense was dipping, but he was coming off, honestly, a pretty good offensive year with the Chicago Cubs in 2021. Now, granted, he didn't play much. He had only 112 plate appearances in 2021, but he had a 110 WRC plus. He was slugging .454. He was still a reliable hitter at the plate and still not a horrendous, maybe at best he could be an average defensive catcher. And with his leadership, it felt like a really good backup to bring in. I commended Mike Elias on that move in terms of backup catcher for going and getting a guy like Robinson Chirinos. But as we know and as we saw, it kind of all came crashing down for Chirinos, who started the year as the Orioles' starting catcher, and then, of course, was replaced by Adley Rutschman when Adley was called up in mid-May. They kind of split time for a while there into early June before Adley basically took over full-time catching duties, and Chirinos was down to playing once, maybe twice at most per week for the Orioles, basically through July, August, September, and a bit of June as well. But his season was 67 games for the Orioles, and in 220 plate appearances, the offense was pretty abysmal. A 179 average with a 265 on base and a 287 slugging. The big drop in his numbers was that slugging percentage. The power completely went away. He slugged 454 last year, slugged 287 this year in double the plate appearances. He just could not drive the baseball at all and ended up with a 61 WRC plus this season. What does that mean? That means he was 39% worse than the league average hitter in Major League Baseball in 2022. It was not good. He hit only 4 home runs, 31% strikeout rate to just a 9% walk rate this year for Robinson Chirinos. Got a little unlucky at times with a 248 BABIP, but he was just a bad player. And you could see it. His Fangraphs WAR, negative 1.6. Negative 1.6. He was the least valuable player on the Baltimore Orioles this season, negative 1.6, the worst WAR of any Oriole, and one of the worst in the big leagues as well. And obviously the bat did him in terms of his WAR. I mean, he rarely produced a big hit for the Orioles. I mean, I think it's a pretty safe argument that his biggest moment as a batter for the Orioles this year was back in May before Adley was called up. He was still the starting catcher. It was in the 10th inning of a game against the Red Sox and a tie game, runner on second with nobody out. He tries to lay down a sac bunt, and the Red Sox pitcher, Sawamura, picks it up, turns around and tries to throw Jorge Mateo out at third base and just chucks the ball into left field. Mateo scores easily on the error to walk it off for the Orioles. And that was a kind of popped up bad bunt by Chirinos. And that was his biggest moment with the bat with the Orioles this year. It wasn't good. And when you combine that with the defense being horrendous, it was tough to watch him this year. He had a negative 10 defensive runs saved behind the plate for the Orioles. Among catchers who caught at least 50 innings this season, that negative 10 defensive runs saved was the third worst in all of baseball. According to Fangraphs, he was the third worst framer. According to StatCast and Baseball Savant, he was the dead last worst framer of 62 qualified framing catchers in Major League Baseball this year, which is basically everybody, every main starter and backup in the league. And he was the worst in terms of his framing, stealing strikes, framing runs. He was awful behind the plate. He was hurting the Orioles pitching staff when he was catching this year. Now, maybe he wasn't hurting them all the way because he's been around and he's a veteran presence. And, I think he did a good job mentoring Adley. And certainly he was a great clubhouse presence for the Orioles. I mean, the O's loved Robinson Chirinos as a clubhouse guy. Did he produce on the field? No. He had one good month in August when he went 8 for 20 at the plate. He was very limited in his playing time in August. That was, when the Orioles were playing well, they were in the wild card race. He was basically playing once a week. He went 8 for 20 with a home run and 7 singles. That's a 400 average. That was really the only time he produced offensively at all was, basically those 6 games or so, 5 games basically that he played in the month of August. Other than that, he didn't really give the O's anything offensively, anything defensively. All of his value came in clubhouse leadership. You heard so many different Orioles players talk throughout the season about how much Chirinos meant to the team. They had the, Robbie's playlist shirts made about all the sayings that Chirinos would yell out in the dugout during games to keep things loose, keep the team energized. He was a great leader inside the clubhouse as well. He was a good mentor to Adley Rutschman, I think helped him out throughout this season. And it's interesting because, it felt like the things you heard, he was good working with the pitchers in terms of not in games, but in games, he was just a disaster with his framing, with throwing runners out. It just was not good at all, and he couldn't hit either. So maybe he helped the Orioles some behind the scenes, but in general on the field, he really never helped the O's. And there's something to say about being an important clubhouse leader, especially on a young team that was severely overachieving this year. That is what the Orioles did. But he just can't be the catcher again next year. Frankly, it feels like this was probably Chirinos' last year in the big leagues. He had a horrendous 2020. He bounced back with a good 2021 in small sample size, and then was terrible on the field this season. He's 38 years old. He'll be 39 next June. He said after the season, he was looking to, try and maybe play one more year, but he did say if it is time, it's time. And he, would potentially be ready to hang him up. I think Chirinos probably is going to retire. I don't see another team even giving him a minor league deal with how bad he was this year. And that'll probably be it for him. I hope he stays around the game. He seems to be a great guy who helped the O's in the clubhouse. It didn't happen on the field for Robinson Chirinos this season. But the same could be said, at least offensively, for Anthony Bemboom, who served as Chirinos' backup this year. before Adley Rutschman came to the big leagues. But the one thing Bemboom did this year that Chirinos did not was actually play some defense behind the plate and help out his pitching staff. So coming up next, we'll talk about Bemboom's defense, why it's a plus, his bat, why it isn't, and if he's the front runner right now to be Adley Rutschman's backup catcher for the Orioles in 2023. But first, got to tell you about Roan, because the dress shirt, well, it was due for a radical reinvention. And Roan, they stepped up to the challenge. Roan's commuter shirt is the most comfortable, breathable, and flexible shirt known to man. And here's why. Roan's comfortable four-way stretch fabric provides breathability and flexibility that leaves you free to enjoy what life throws your way, from your commute to work or your 18 holes of golf. And you can feel confident with a wrinkle-free shirt without the hassle with Roan's wrinkle release technology. And they've got Gold Fusion anti-odor technology, so you'll be smelling fresh and clean all day long. And on top of that, here's the easy part. Roan, 100% machine washable. You can ditch the dry cleaner for these fantastic shirts. This commuter shirt, it's going to get you through any workday and straight into whatever comes next. So head to roan.com/lockedon and use promo code lockedon to save 20% on your entire order. That's 20% off your entire order when you head to RHONE.com/lockedon and use code lockedon. It's time to find your corner office comfort. So we're talking about two backup catchers on today's episode, reviewing 2022 seasons for Orioles players, and just talked about how much of a tough season it was, at least on the field, for Robinson Chirinos. But at least at the dish, it was a similarly tough season for Anthony Bemboom, who started out the year as the Orioles' backup catcher. And then after Adley Rutschman was called up, Bemboom spent the rest of the year in AAA Norfolk. But he did put together some impressive stats, at least defensively, and working with the pitching staff. So Bemboom came in for the Orioles on a minor league deal this offseason and impressed enough in spring training after Adley Rutschman went down with a tricep injury that he won the backup catcher job coming out of spring training behind Robinson Chirinos. And Bemboom did not play much. He was on the team from opening day until mid to late May when Adley Rutschman was called up, and then Bemboom was sent down to AAA. Now, in his stretch with the Orioles, again, it was just about 22 games in a month and a half, and he only had 59 plate appearances. But Anthony Bemboom, who is a left-handed batter, certainly did not hit. And honestly, he hit less than Robinson Chirinos did. Bemboom hit just 115 with a 207 average, or with a 207 on base, I should say, and a 212 slugging percentage. That is a 22 WRC plus. He was 78% worse than a league average hitter this year. The raw stats, 6 for 52. That's right. He had 6 hits this season, 6 for 52 with a home run, 17 strikeouts, and 6 walks at the plate for the Orioles this season. Now, that was bad. He had that one home run in the series in St. Louis against the Cardinals that basically came out of nowhere. And then he really did not do anything else at all with the bat in his 59 plate appearances. But what he did do is at least show off defensively. And now, with only 22 games played, you're not going to get a good number with these advanced defensive stats. They had him at 0 defensive runs saved, which puts him at league average. They had him, his framing value right around 0, his framing runs right around 0. Basically, everything said he was slightly above average as a defensive catcher. But everything you saw in AAA and a bigger sample size and everything you heard from down there was that Bemboom was, if not an elite, then close to it, defensive catcher for the Orioles at the AAA and MLB level. And it sounded like pitchers really liked working with him as well. And he had good framing numbers earlier in his career when he was with the Angels in the big leagues the last few years as well. Got good marks in AAA with LA. And that's why the Orioles brought him in. And that's why he won the backup catcher job. It was not for his bat, but it was for his glove. And again, the bat was better in AAA, but it certainly was not there. 34 games in AAA. He had 137 plate appearances. He hit 228 with a 292 on base and a 350 slugging with a 70 WRC plus for the Norfolk Tides. Now, he did hit 8 home runs, and he only had a 20% strikeout rate, so he was putting the ball in play, just not hitting it hard too often to get on base. But the Orioles seem to like him. I mean, he's 32 years old. He'll be 33 in January, left-handed hitting catcher, with with a little pop in the bat at times, but generally not a good hitter, just a good defensive catcher who frames the ball well and works with the pitching staff. And he always felt fairly comfortable defensively in the 22 games that Bemboom caught for the Orioles before he was sent down to AAA. And I made the argument here a few times on this podcast that I think the Orioles would have been better with Bemboom as Adley's backup instead of Chirinos. Now, Chirinos gave a lot in terms of leadership, and if there was a way for him to still be in the dugout, that would have been great, but not really playing. But you could argue, well, Bemboom's bat was bad in AAA and was horrendous in the big leagues, and maybe it would have been worse than Chirinos's, and I would give you that. Maybe it would have been worse than Chirinos's, but his defense would have been miles and miles ahead of Chirinos. So it makes you wonder, was the leadership thing and the MLB experience just the thing that put Chirinos over the top? Probably to be the backup catcher for Adley. But then you see what the Orioles did with Bemboom this offseason. Now, when he was sent down, he was actually DFA'd by the Orioles and he was not claimed. So he stayed in AAA, but was not on the 40-man roster. And he spent the entire year off the 40-man roster. O's only had 2 catchers on it all season, or for most of the season at least, with Adley Rutschman and Robinson Chirinos after Adley was called up. But it's been interesting to see what the Orioles have done with Bemboom since then, because they put Bemboom and selected him to the 40-man roster right after the season ended. Then once they did that, he was arbitration eligible. And on Wednesday, they agreed to a contract with Anthony Bemboom for the 2023 season to avoid arbitration. Now, we haven't gotten an exact number on that as I record here on Wednesday night, but we do know, according to Andy Costco of the Baltimore Sun, that it is a split deal. So he'll be making less money if he does end up in AAA, and then obviously he'll get more if he ends up in the big leagues as Adley's backup. And I will say, it's not like Bemboom was already on the 40-man and the Orioles didn't want to have to DFA him again and lose him. He was off the 40-man roster, and they specifically put him back on the 40-man before the offseason and specifically came to a contract to avoid arbitration, and he didn't end up being a non-tender guy. All these moves tell me that, the O's could still go after another catcher. But these moves tell me that Anthony Bemboom is at least a front runner heading into the offseason to be Adley Rutschman's backup catcher next year. And we'll get to this more in a bit, but I like his defense. I think his bat could play a little better with a higher sample size. It's nice to have a left-handed bat, back there as your backup catcher. And Orioles pitchers, especially in AAA, seem to like working with him. And I think that's why the Orioles added him to the roster. So the question becomes, if he is the front runner, is he just going to win that job? Or are there other internal or external candidates that could be Adley's backup in 2023? We'll try to answer that question coming up next. So we've looked at the seasons for Robinson Chirinos and for Anthony Bemboom with the Orioles and the Norfolk Tides in 2022. And we've concluded neither of them really hit. Bemboom much better defensively, and Robinson Chirinos probably will retire. But Anthony Bemboom, he's going to be in the organization, it looks like, in 2023, with the Orioles adding him back to the 40-man and coming to agreement on a contract for next season. So the question is Anthony Bemboom going to be Adley's backup next year? And he certainly looks like the front runner, but there are many other options, and many that we have talked about even recently on this podcast. With Robinson Chirinos still technically on the 40-man roster until the playoffs end, his contract expires, and he becomes a free agent. The Orioles currently have 6 catchers on their 40-man roster. They've got Adley Rutschman. They've got Robinson Chirinos. They added Anthony Bemboom. Then, if you remember, in September, the Orioles claimed Cam Gallagher off waivers from the San Diego Padres, was kind of backup catcher type with Kansas City and San Diego. I thought he might come to the big leagues after that. He never did, but he was in AAA and stayed with the Orioles. And then they claimed 2 other catchers last week from the Reds. We talked about them on Monday's episode. Make sure and go back to listen to that one or watch if you haven't already. But they claimed Aramis Garcia and Mark Colesbury, 2 catchers off waivers from the Reds. And both of those guys are now on the 40-man as well, and at least probably going to get a shot, even if the Orioles DFA them and they come off the 40-man, are both going to get a shot to win that backup catcher job. So you look at 6 catchers on the 40-man, and Chirinos will come off. So when the offseason starts, the Orioles theoretically could have 5 catchers on their 40-man roster. So 4 guys competing for that one backup job behind Adley. And that makes you think, would they really go out and spend on a backup if they have all these internal options taking up 40-man roster spots? And again, guys like Colesbury and Garcia might just get DFA'd at some point this offseason. I could certainly see it coming. You're going to have to DFA him at some point. You're not going to carry 5 catchers on the 40-man beginning of next year. But there are some interesting options in free agency. I mean, you have the big names like Wilson Contreras and Gary Sanchez. I don't think the Orioles are going after those guys, but you've got the kind of defense-first veteran guys out there like Austin Hedges and Kirk Casale and Sandy Leon will all be free agents this year. And the O's could go after those guys if they can get them on cheap, one-year deals to come and try and back up Adley. I mean, I think Austin Hedges would be the ideal backup for Adley. He can't really hit, but he is a top 5 defensive catcher in all of baseball. If you can have that behind the plate once, maybe twice a week, you are golden with your pitching staff. And, he's been the starting catcher for a playoff Cleveland Guardians team this year. So at least he has the experience of trying to hit in big spots, which will help you out. But I mean, it's going to be tough if the O's are going to hold on to all 5 of these catchers. It's going to be tough to see them signing another catcher for anything more than a cheap one-year deal, similar to the one they gave Chirinos last offseason. So if I had to make a prediction right now with how the Orioles have operated in the first few weeks of this offseason, I would predict that Anthony Bemboom is the Orioles' backup catcher to Adley Rutschman on opening day of 2023. I think there'll be a competition. I think Cam Gallagher will certainly give him a run for his money. And I do think the Orioles will still look into potentially bringing in a free agent as well to compete for that job. But with the O's specifically putting him on the 40-man, liking his defense so much and holding on to him in AAA all of this year, despite being 32 years old, I think Anthony Bemboom could be the guy. And that doesn't mean he's going to be the backup all of next year. Maybe they try it out. Maybe they bring a guy like Jacob Nottingham back, who I haven't even mentioned. They also brought in Nottingham on a minor league deal last offseason. And, he had big league time with the Brewers and the Mariners, and he certainly hit, pretty well at times in AAA Norfolk, but just never got that big league chance just because his defense wasn't as good as Bemboom's has been. So maybe he's in this mix as well. Certainly can't count him out, especially if the O's bring him back, Nottingham, on a minor league deal. But I think Bemboom's got the inside track. And my prediction right now, and that could change, obviously, if the Orioles make a free agent signing, but my prediction right now is Bemboom is Adley's backup going into next year. And listen, if he hits 115, probably not going to work out. But if he can hit somewhere around 200, hit a couple homers, and play that elite defense behind the plate, that's all you really need in your backup catcher when your starter is an all-star in Adley Rutschman and a guy who, at worst, is already the second best catcher in baseball behind JT Realmuto, and at best might already be the best catcher with the offense and defense combination in all of baseball. So you don't need a lot of production from that backup catcher spot. You need a good defender who will work with your pitching staff and is ready to play one day a week. That's what you need. And Anthony Bemboom, I think, even at 33, could give the Orioles that next season. So we will see, though. The O's, they'll be wheeling and dealing, making some more waiver claims, maybe signing a catcher. And, of course, we'll have it all covered for you here on the podcast this offseason. But we've got one more episode coming up this week. That's tomorrow, a Friday episode to finish off the week. We're talking Kyle Bradish on tomorrow's episode. Going to break down his up and down 2022 rookie season, from the good debut to the struggles to the amazing outing in St. Louis, then the injury, and then how good he looked returning from injury, all kind of culminating with those 2 amazing starts against the Houston Astros. We'll break down his season, talk about where he fits into the Orioles rotation going into 2023, coming up on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.